Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at later medieval punishments. In Norman times, suspicious deaths had often fallen under murderum laws, which I've covered in a previous video, but later this changed. Richard I introduced the role of the coroner in 1194 to investigate deaths where there was no obvious cause. In 1195 he appointed some knights to be keepers of the king's peace, in unruly communities where normal methods like the hue and cry were falling short of delivering law and order. This system worked, and in 1327 King Edward III extended the system nationally, and this represents quite a move towards centralising royal power over law and order, but that's something that's only going to extend. Eventually this would lead to justices of the peace. Previously, law and order had been kept locally by people appointed from roughly within the community, shire reeves and sheriffs and the like. After 1327, the system was increasingly centralised, with appointments made directly by the king. But by 1361, this had become even more centralised, as these law enforcers became known as justices of the peace. They met 4 times a year to carry out their duties in enforcing the law, and here we can see an early reference to them. They're called guardians of the peace in this particular statute of 1344, but they're essentially the same thing. The most substantial, that means important and powerful, persons within counties shall be appointed guardians of the peace by commission of the king, and whenever need may require shall hear and determine felonies, that's major crimes, and trespasses, minor crimes, against the peace in the same counties, and inflict reasonable punishment. So here we can see some of their duties. Inflicting reasonable punishment basically means passing sentence. Because they were appointed by the king, this represents another extension of the power of the king over law and order, and a further centralisation of law and order to the king's government. Justices of the peace could be seen as quite harsh to some offenders though, particularly poachers. As the justices of the peace were landowners themselves, they particularly wanted to protect their own interests, and so harsh punishments under things like the forest laws of these people were often meted out. Harsher still, though, were the punishments handed out for high treason. Most punishments in medieval times were little different from the earlier medieval period, being a mixture of fines, corporal punishment, and for the most serious crimes, execution. However, a new crime of high treason was introduced, and this was very serious. High treason was a crime against the king, including plotting to either kill or betray him. The sentence was to be hanged, drawn and quartered, which was intended to have a significant deterrent effect. And this really and literally is a fate worse than just death. So what did hanged, drawn and quartered actually mean? If you're a little bit squeamish, you might want to prepare yourself for this description, because the punishment for treason was deliberately designed for maximum pain, horror and deterrent. First, the convicted traitor was publicly dragged behind a horse to the place of execution. This added humiliation to the punishment, and it's one interpretation of the word drawn within the title, although it more likely refers to a later and even more gruesome part of the process. Then the traitor would be hanged by the neck until agonisingly strangled, but crucially not until they were dead. They would be cut down and then revived with a slap or a bucket of water. After this, the traitor had their body cut open and their intestines drawn out of them and put on a fire while they were still alive, although it's doubtful that they'd stay alive for much longer. Then they were beheaded, and then the corpse was then quartered, with the parts sent to major settlements around the country as a gruesome deterrent to others, with their body parts on display, much as you can see in this picture. So to be hanged, drawn and quartered was really a fate worse than just execution, and was supposed to deter people from committing crimes against the highest authority in the land, the king. Treason laws still exist, but these days they're against the country rather than just the king. The process of that change we'll cover in a future video. Before we conclude our look at law and order in the medieval period, we're going to have a quick recap of the themes of continuity and change in a couple of areas. Firstly, enforcing the law. Let's consider what the enforcement of the law was like in the Saxon period. It was, generally speaking, community law enforcement, which included the hue and cry and shire reeves. Then in the Norman period we have examples of continuity and change. What stayed roughly the same was that community law enforcement remained really important, including the hue and cry. But there was a growing royal authority rather than simply a local authority overdoing this. Then in the later medieval period, this develops further. Community law enforcement remains really important in local areas, but there's increasing centralisation, as we've covered in this video, with the appointment of justices of the peace and coroners directly by the king. But then what about punishments themselves? In Saxon times, typical punishments included fines, the confiscation of property, corporal punishment, so that is harm done to the body, maiming, so cutting body parts off, hanging, and indeed burning. There's a certain amount of continuity into the Norman period. Fines carried on, as did corporal punishment against the body and maiming people. But in the Norman period, there was an extension of the number of crimes for which you could be executed, which usually meant being executed by hanging. They also introduced the stocks and pillory as a humiliating form of local punishment. And then in the later medieval period, there's continuity as the fines and stocks and pillory and corporal punishment carried on, as well as maiming and hanging. These things were all seen as being broadly good deterrents and effective. But hanging, drawing and quartering was introduced as an even more serious and unpleasant form of execution. Let's sum up then. Later medieval punishments include examples of both change and continuity. Examples of continuity include the continued use of fines as a punishment, corporal and physical punishment too, including the humiliating local ordeal of being put in the stocks and the pillory, and the continued use of execution by hanging. But there were changes too. These included the introduction of coroners to investigate suspicious deaths, and the introduction of justices of the peace. Both of these people were actually appointed directly by the king, which shows that centralisation of power. Hanging, drawing and quartering for high treason was also introduced as a new form of punishment. These changes represent a continued trend of centralisation, with the king extending his power over both the enforcement of the law and the punishment of criminals. But that's the end of this video for now, so thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel too. I'll be releasing more content as we go through this topic, so if there are any topics that you're desperate for me to get onto, or if you want to get an idea of when they're going to be released, pop it in the comments below and I'll see if I can tell you. But for now, thanks for watching and goodbye.